Hey everyone, Chat Cemetery is back, as is Alex DiVincenzo. Today we're talking all about Pet Sematary 2, which is a direct sequel, kinda, sorta, not really, to the 1989 Pet Cemetery. I mean, you have Mary Lambert coming back as a director, so in a way there is some continuity there, but it's all new characters with the exception of one person who we will discuss momentarily. But Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. I'd seen this movie once many years ago and didn't remember very much of it at all. Really, the only thing that I remembered was the dirt bike scene, which lived up to what I remembered. And then I just rewatched it like moments before we started recording, so I'm eager to jump in.
Yeah, so why don't we go ahead and kick this off with a little discussion on the casting, because I think you have some great names in here, but then when you see the movie, you're kind of like, oh, that really didn't live up to what I was expecting it to be given the names. And one major one is Clancy Brown, who we see again in the King universe later on in The Shawshank Redemption, if I'm not mistaken. And he is someone who has definitely made a name for himself over the years, but in this, you're just kind of like, oh, he's one of these characters. And you don't like him at all in it. And you could argue that there always needs to be a bad guy, but there were quite a few bad guys in this movie. And at times, you're kind of like, oh, okay, well, obviously, Clancy Brown did what he could with the performance given the script and direction and everything. And I do quickly want to add that Mary Lambert was 5 months pregnant when she was directing this. So it wasn't exactly the best time for her to be directing a movie necessarily, but she was open to it because the first one did so well that the studios wanted a second one. And it's, I guess at that point, kind of like, well, why not be involved with it if you can? Because then you sort of at least have a little bit of control over it. But another familiar face was Anthony Edwards. And I had no idea that he was in this prior to going into it. Clancy Brown was kind of the only one I had known about going into it. And I was surprised because I had just watched him in something recently. He was in the Netflix season of Designated Survivor after Netflix had kind of saved that show. And I was like, this voice sounds so familiar. So for you, were you familiar with at least those two guys going into this?
Yes, I knew Clancy Brown. Like you said, he obviously went on to do much better King work. Anthony Edwards, I didn't know by name, but then I looked him up, and he's like, "Oh, it's Goose from Top Gun." That's how I know him.
Yeah.
But the person who I recognized was Edward Furlong because he was like hot off of the Terminator 2 success, and I think that's like one of my favorite action movies ever made. So it's interesting to see like this was he probably I would imagine had like a lot of opportunities following that movie, and it's kind of interesting that this is what he went with.
Hmm.
Not to say that it's like a bad movie, but it's I mean I had to imagine he had better offers on the table, but I mean, it was like an IP. You know, Pet Sematary was a big name. The first one did really well. But yeah, just really interesting to see like this was his immediate follow up.
Yeah, and most of the other people in this, I would say, aren't super familiar names or faces. At least they weren't for me. I know Darlan Flugel. I have no idea if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I was like, oh, it's kind of like Darlene, but it's not Darlene, and it's, a little unique first name there for her. But my mom had recognized her, and she had been in some other movies and stuff, but overall on IMDb, she's credited with less than 30 things, so not quite to the extent that Anthony Edwards and Clancy Brown have been in, but still familiar enough to probably some people who watch things in the 80s and 90s.
Yeah, she's one who like I looked up her credits. I was like, oh, I've seen her in things, but you
Yeah.
know, she doesn't have like that. She doesn't have like that one big role, at least not to me. That one big role that like everyone's gonna identify her with.
Yeah, so she plays Jeff's mom, and she is killed off right away. This movie does not linger or anything before getting to a death scene, so they don't really waste any time. But
Can we talk about how she dies? Because I love movies that are about making movies, even though
yeah.
they're always like super cheesy because they're never really like an actual movie set. I just love like the Hollywoodization of Hollywood. So I really love
Yes.
that opening, even though it doesn't last very long. But I love that, and I also love that there's a Halloween scene, which is a separate scene, but I just feel like any scene set on Halloween makes a movie inherently better.
Yeah, and you have Jeff watching his mother, who's an actress, go through numerous takes, and one ends poorly because one of the guys complains that he can't see what he's doing underneath the stage. So they put a light down there so he can see and hit the mark because he's the one who keeps missing it and ruining the scene, basically. And everything goes wrong. There's water, there's lights, that's not a good combo. And then she gets completely electrocuted. And a quick aside on the electrocution scenes in this, because there's more than one, and they're all bad. None of them look particularly great, and it's just so over exaggerated. And like you said, it's sort of this view of what Hollywood is like. And for a second, you think it's some sort of effect, but really in the back of your mind, it's not. So they get to that death scene quickly, and the story goes on to really retell the same story from Pet Sematary, but the roles are flipped. It's the kids who are bringing the parents back or the adults back. And you have Drew, who befriends Jeff because he's being made fun of, and Drew is sort of used to that because he's the chubby kid, and his stepfather is Clancy Brown's character, Gus, who is also the sheriff in town. So he kind of gets away with being a dick to everyone, especially Drew. And you just have these characters in this story that feel familiar, but at the same time, you're kind of like, oh, I see what you did here, but it didn't feel as effective from an emotional standpoint as the original movie.
Yeah, Pet Cemetery was the first Stephen King book I read because my mom told me it was the scariest book she ever read. And I recognize now as an adult the reason why it was so scary to her was because she had young children, and I didn't see that at the time. I just saw creepy undead animals. But if I had seen Pet Cemetery 2 as a kid, I think I would have liked it more than the original because it has the child protagonist.
Mm-hmm.
I thought it was kind of interesting that they did the perspective change. Doesn't quite have the same impact as losing a child, but obviously a child losing their parent is also super uncomfortable. And it kind of gives it almost like a coming of age type story at its
Yeah.
core, which I'm a sucker for. But beyond that, like you said, it's essentially the first film's plot, but the characters aren't as developed. You're not as emotionally invested, and I feel like the pacing isn't as good.
It really felt like it was trying to be like Stand By Me with a Raising the Dead story tacked onto it.
Exactly. Which I appreciate the effort. It just in execution didn't quite live up to that.
Yeah, and I honestly found myself a little bored with the story, maybe because it was just rehashed and the roles were sort of reversed, and you really didn't have any real emotional connection to this family because Jeff was always going out and doing his own thing. He was never really with his dad because he was sort of at that older age where kids don't really want to hang around with their parents quite as much. And, in the original, Ellie and Gage aren't old enough to go out on their own and be hanging out with friends, really. So you have that difference that I think sort of slowed things down for me and made it less entertaining because while you want that Stand By Me coming of age story, you also have this whole Pet Cemetery story tacked onto it. Not necessarily tacked onto it, but in addition to. And it never really felt like either portion fully lived up to expectations, and they didn't mesh in a way that I thought was too compelling.
Yeah, I agree. Going into this, I kind of, based on my memories, feared it was just going to be the same movie over again. So I was like vaguely presently surprised that it at least had some slight twist on it. It wasn't, at least it was almost like Mad Libs. They changed the characters but keep all the plot beats the same. But it was too familiar for its own good.
Yeah, I really think where Pet Cemetery thrives is in that emotional connection that you get when, the parents lose a child. But in this, it just felt like Jeff was upset about his mother's death, but he didn't seem super visibly upset with it. It was one of those things where only if someone brought her up would he be upset, which seemed a little unrealistic because it wasn't like it happened all that long ago. And he seemed to be really close with his mom, given what we saw in that opening scene when he shows up on set and, she's excited to see him and he's excited to be watching her work. You sort of get this connection. And then it's like, as soon as she dies, that just completely goes away until the very strange ending.
You bring up a good point earlier about his age. I feel like it might have played better. I mean, they couldn't have cast Edward Furlong, but like if it was more like an 8-year-old as opposed to however old he was supposed to be, 13, 14, something like that. If he was just a little bit younger, he wasn't so, he didn't have like the teen angst or whatever you want to call it, and still kind of depended on his mother a little bit more.
Yeah, maybe if he was like 10 or so,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
even, just a few years younger, that would have played off a lot better because then he would have sort of this innocence to him to where it would be believable that he would believe everything he's being told about the pet cemetery and the burial grounds and everything like that. Because in the original, we see that Louis Creed is just so overcome with grief that he's willing to believe anything if it'll bring his kid back. And that is a believable storyline because what parent doesn't want to bring their kid back when they're taken away from them way too soon?
Right. And in this one, it's just kind of like, well, he's a dumb kid.
Yeah. And you kind of get this feeling that he's not actually a dumb kid. And so it was just one of those things where it didn't flow quite as well as I was hoping. And, Drew was a little more believable when he went and brought his dog back because that was something where, Gus went out, shot the dog, and Drew really cared for this animal and instantly was like, okay, we're going to bring the dog back. And then they bring Gus back too, which is a whole other story. Why would you want to bring that man back of all people? That made no sense to me. I was like, but you don't know if he's going to be worse to you or not.
I guess there was a lateral move at worst with him, but you also you're a little kid. You don't want to. Well, even if you're an adult, you don't want to be considered a murderer. I feel like that's frowned upon in society.
That one was definitely done more out of fear than out of
Yeah,
wanting to bring him
exactly.
back. They were like, oh my goodness, we can't get in trouble. And I understand that. But at the same time, a dog attacked him. That's not
True.
really murder.
They had an excuse. Yeah.
It's like, what do you want me to do? I mean, worst case, they would put the already dead dog down.
Yeah.
I feel like. So because they're kids, you can sort of understand their reasoning. But as people who are older now, you're like, no, I would not have brought Gus back. No, thank you.
What I found like kind of interesting is that they do talk about what they call the Creed murders, and it's almost like it's this local urban legend, even though it only happened like 3 years prior. I thought that was like
Yeah.
a weird choice. Like in at its core, it's like an interesting way to look at where it becomes this urban legend because obviously in the first one, very few people know about it, but now since then there's been this family murdered, so the townspeople talk about it. But now the kids talk about it like it happened 50 years ago. But as far as I can tell, it's set, present day, then 1992 or whatever. So that it was just weird that they talked about it like, maybe this is real, maybe it's not, but like it definitely happened.
I thought that was very weird too, because maybe it was one of those things where the town tried to keep it under wraps. And so word just sort of trickled out, and it's like playing a game of telephone where you don't get all the facts by the end of it. And
Yeah, I think that's got to be it. But I feel like there could have been some, like a quick scene, even a quick line of exposition
yeah,
from the sheriff or whatever. That's like, we tried to keep this buried before. I don't know, just something to cover their ass there.
yeah, making it an urban legend, I was like, don't those take a little more time to develop?
Yeah,
It was definitely one of those things where you're just like, okay, all right, I see how they're trying to not necessarily retcon the original in, but just make a nod to it. And you have a line later where I believe it's Jeff's mom after she comes back from the burial grounds and she says dead is better. And
yeah,
you're kind of like, all right, that was a little on the nose. Thank you for that.
yeah. Because I mean, who are you quoting? No one said that before.
How would you know? Did you have anything that you actively enjoyed about this movie, though?
I will say, like I said, I think there's like a good version of Pet Cemetery 2 in this movie. It just
Uh
didn't
huh.
quite come out. I think if it was set, maybe a few more years in the future, had a younger lead, and they played up the urban legend aspect and made it more of a coming of age story that happened to have people coming back to life. Like I think there's a really cool movie there. This one is not quite it. I think the maybe not the best scene, but the most memorable scene now is where the taxidermist it pokes out the fake dog's eyes or the taxidermy dog's eyes. That kind of freaked me out a little bit in a weird way.
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that there is one character who rolls over from the original, and that character was only mentioned by name in the original film, and it's the vet who tended to Church when Church came back from the dead. And you have Jeff's father, who is a veterinarian himself, going to visit this other veterinarian and ask his opinion on, what happened with Zowie, the dog, because the dog didn't have a heartbeat, and the vet kind of just snaps back at him, gives him all the facts, and is like, is this what happened? And then he just starts laughing like a total creep. And it's such a weird scene and throwback to the original that you don't necessarily need. And I wasn't really sure if they were just trying to kind of be like, oh, this is a thing that really did happen. And that's sort of how they were covering up the urban legend thing on their end.
Yeah, there was a lot of weird choices made there. Like I always think it's cool when sequels bring back, obviously they couldn't bring back the original family, but I think it was cool that they tried to do some sort of crossover with the original movie, so it didn't feel quite so much like a rehash. But the way they chose to do it was just, I don't know, baffling. It was I don't know. That was a weird choice.
Yeah, it really was. And honestly, I don't even know how much more I have to say about this movie. So I guess I'll turn it over to you if you have any additional thoughts or anything you would like to ask about this.
Here are some notes that I didn't address that I wrote while I was watching it. Let's see. Oh, weird, unnecessary rape scene. I
Yes.
mean, almost all rape scenes are unnecessary, but this one was particularly out of left field and weird and uncomfortable. Not that you see much or anything, but just the fact that it exists in this movie is wildly unnecessary.
And the fact that you know it happened because basically Gus comes back from the dead and he's being oddly nice to Drew all of a sudden and then turns around and rapes his mom. And you're like,
Yeah.
okay, why? Like, that made
Yes.
no sense given what Gus's personality was supposed to be like after he came back from the dead. But then he kills them later anyway, too. And you're just like, all right.
Yeah. At least be consistent. I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I was looking for some consistency there too. I was expecting him to be even more of a jerk to Drew, which would have made more sense given the other two events that happened.
right, right. So the scariest part of the original Pet Cemetery is Zelda.
Yes.
And we don't have anything that comes anywhere close to it in that. Like I said,
Nope.
the dog eyes being popped out freaked me out. I like that they put a Ramon song over the end credits. So that was a fun little nod.
Yeah.
And I read after that Mary Lambert originally wanted Ellie Creed to be the lead, but the studio didn't want a teenage girl as their protagonist. So
Well,
they,
that's just rude.
yeah, really. I mean that would be. I mean that would give an excuse for you to rehash the original plot, and then obviously be a direct through line between the two. The really weird. I mean, I feel like that was also early '90s. I guess times are different now, but it just seems like such a weird. Like, why wouldn't you want to continue with an original cast member?
Yeah.
But I guess they got Edward Furlong, who, like I said, was big at the time. But I wonder like that what that movie would have been. And then I also read, and I wonder if this might have changed as well. It was originally advertised as Stephen King's Pet Cemetery 2, but King had his name removed from it because obviously he had no involvement in it. He had written not only the book, obviously, but wrote the first script for the first movie as well.
Mm-hmm. I don't think he even had a cameo in this one, did he?
No, he did not. I
Okay.
was looking out because they have a funeral scene. I was like, oh, is he gonna play the priest
Is he
again?
going to
That'd
be
be
the
a nice little
minister again?
nod. But yeah, that would have been a fun little nod. But no, no such luck.
Yeah, I was kind of looking for it too. And I was like, you know what? I don't think he shows up in this. And then before we recorded this, I have the Creep Shows book that kind of gives you facts about the various movies and TV shows that he's done over the years, or that have been done over the years of his works. And with Pet Sematary Two, they were like, we don't even know if he read the script. So that's how little involvement he had in this one. And he eventually told Fangoria that he did read part of the script, but I don't think he ever made his way through the rest of it at any point. So it's one of those things where you can understand them wanting to bring Mary Lambert back and wanting to tell this story in a different light, but it just didn't fully grasp what I think expectations were either at the time or, with us watching it now, you again and me for the first time, because I had never watched this. And I was like, all right, I'll watch it because, I have to for the podcast, but I don't think I'm going to enjoy it. And seeing the cast members, you're kind of a little disappointed by the end of it because there are some good performances individually, but it just never comes together as a whole.
Yeah, and even with the good performances, the characters are all still pretty one-dimensional, so it's hard to get over that, get beyond that.
Yeah, so I don't think there's really too terribly much else to say about this, but why don't we go into some ratings? I know I've been a little more harsh on some of these movies that you and I have both watched than you have, but we seem to pretty much be in agreement on sometimes they come back, and it seems like so far on this one. So out of 5, what would you give this?
I think I'd give it a 2.5.
Okay.
Like I don't regret the time spent watching it, but now that I've revisited once after like 10 years, I probably won't watch it again for another 10 years.
I gave it a 2 out of 5. I was willing to give it that because of some of those individual performances I mentioned, and it really just felt like the groundwork was there, but something just didn't come together. And more likely than not, it has a lot to do with the studio decisions, not necessarily anything that Mary Lambert personally wanted to do. And like you mentioned, the studio kept her from making some of the choices she wanted to make. So, I recently on my other podcast, Welcome to Geekdom, talked about Spider-Man 3. And that's another movie that has a ton of problems, and a lot of them have to do with the studio wanting what the studio wanted. So you have these movies that this happens to quite often, and they typically tend to be sequels. Let's be honest here. There are a lot of sequels where you're like, no, you didn't need that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when anything is a success, the more people want to be involved in anything that comes after it. And you get your too many cooks situation where everyone's giving input and whoever's signing the checks think they have, the best ideas. But it's weird that you'd hire the same director again who made you this successful movie and not kind of just let her do whatever she wants, because people are going to come see it, hopefully based on the name alone. Plus, she already proved herself. It's weird. But I am interested. Scream Factory, who does a lot of great like special edition of old horror movies, special editions.
Mm-hmm.
They're releasing this one early next year, and I know Mary Lambert's involved. I'm sure she'll do like a commentary or an interview or something. And I'm really curious to see what she has to say, like kind of reflecting back on it.
That would be very interesting to listen to. I don't know if I want to pay for a copy to do that, though. So we'll have to wait and see, because this was one I think I found somewhere on streaming somewhere. I don't know. It was on Hulu. I'm sure it was somewhere else by now, but those things are always changing. Is there anything else you want to touch on real quick?
No, I think that'll do. Oh, wait, you know what? I do have one more thing.
Oh, good.
Hang on, I gotta look at it. Okay, so we talked about how they say there was like the "sometimes dead is better" quote or whatever.
Uh-huh.
The tagline for Pet Sematary 2 was "Some stories just won't stay dead," and I think that laziness of tagline is indicative of the movie.
I don't think I even noticed that, so I'm glad you brought that up, but I think that wraps up our discussion on this. Before we go, I quickly want to tell you about our Patreon. You can support this podcast for $1 a month or $2 a month. You get a thank you on the show for the first tier. The second tier will get you a Chat Cemetery sticker. You can find us on social media at Chat Cemetery on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook now. Alex, thank you for making your way through this movie so we could have a quick discussion on it.
Thank you for having me. You can find me at brocarfan.com and brocarfan on all social media.
And you will definitely be back on future episodes. And to our listeners, as always, thank you all for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.